The sharp crack of a gunshot quieted every soul in the Last Chance saloon. Harriet Caldwell stood there shaken, her once fine blue dress all torn and dirty, and her hair a wild mess around her pale face. "Where is Edgar Dalton?" she called out, her voice rough after weeks of hollering for help that never showed up. It was June of 1875 out in Riverside, California, and it was plain to see Harriet had just busted out of a bad dream. Jake Zimmer put his whiskey glass down real slow, taking a long look at the young woman who just stumbled through the doors. At 28 years old, he had seen plenty of folks at the end of their rope, but there was something in her eyes, scared but determined, that made him stand up a little straighter from his spot at the bar. The saloon stayed dead quiet. Even the fella at the piano had his fingers frozen right over the keys. "Ma'am, I figure you ought to put that gun down before somebody gets hurt," Jake said. His voice had that bit of a Texas drawl he never could quite shake, even after 5 years in California. His worn leather vest and dusty boots said he was a working man, but the way the other fellas eased away from him told you there was more to him than that. Harriet's hand was trembling, but she kept that pistol aimed straight. "Not till somebody tells me where I can find Edgar Dalton." Her voice nearly broke when she said his name. "He kept me locked in his attic for weeks. Weeks! While this whole town went on with its business, and not one person even asked where I'd gone." The bartender, a big fella named Mac, cleared his throat. "Miss Caldwell, we all figured you'd gone back east after your father passed." "That's just what Mr. Dalton told everybody, wasn't it?" she shot back, tears starting to fill her eyes. "Of course he did. He's the respected businessman, the finest man in the community. Who'd ever think he'd lock up his dead partner's daughter just to get his hands on what my father left me?" Jake started moving toward her, slow and easy, keeping his hands where she could see him. At 30, he'd earned a name for settling trouble without making a big fuss, which was strange for a man who'd spent his younger days pushing cattle and sometimes chasing outlaws. "Miss Caldwell, is it? I believe you. Now please let me help you before the sheriff gets here and gets the wrong idea about all this." Just saying the word sheriff made what little color was left in Harriet's face disappear. "Sheriff Mills is Edgar's cousin. He wouldn't lift a finger to help me if I was standing right in front of him on fire." "Well, I ain't the sheriff," Jake said, plain and simple. He was close enough now to gently take the gun from her shaking hands. "And I don't take kindly to men who harm women, whether they're respected businessmen or not." The second he took the pistol, Harriet started to wobble. All those weeks with barely enough food and water, the pure terror of being locked up, and the burst of energy that got her free just vanished all at once. Jake caught her as her legs gave out, lifting her up in his arms. He was surprisingly gentle for a man so weathered by the sun and trail. "Mac, I'm taking her over to Doc Wilson's," Jake called out, paying no mind to the whispers that started buzzing around the room. "Jake," Mac warned him, "Dalton's got powerful friends. You sure you want to stick your nose in this?" Jake looked down at the woman in his arms, who was barely awake. He saw the raw rope burns on her wrists and the deep hollows in her cheeks. "Seems to me I already have." The town of Riverside was humming with folks, even with the summer heat that danced over the dirt roads. It had only been started a few years back in 1870, but it grew fast on account of the orange groves and the trade routes. Fancy new buildings stood right next to plain old ones, showing you just how fast the town was growing and how the money was flowing to certain folks. Dr. Wilson's office was on a quieter street, a simple wooden building with a small sign hanging in the window. Jake put his boot to the door since his arms were full of Harriet's limp body. "Good heavens," the doctor said as he opened up. He was in his 60s, with a neat white beard, and he'd been taking care of Riverside folks since the beginning. "Bring her in, son. Bring her in." Jake laid Harriet down easy on the examination table. "She says Edgar Dalton had her locked up in his attic for weeks. Says she just got away." The doctor's face got dark as he looked at the burns from the ropes on her wrists and ankles. "These marks look just like she's been tied up for a long spell," he said in a low voice. "And she's bone dry and hasn't had near enough to eat." Harriet's eyes fluttered open, and she got a scared look on her face, seeing she was in another strange place. "No, let me go." "Easy now, Miss Caldwell," Jake said in a soft voice, taking her hand without even thinking about it. "You're at the doctor's. You're safe now." She squeezed his hand with a strength that surprised him. He'll find me. He'll lock me up again. I can't go back there. I'd rather die. Nobody's taking you anywhere, Jake promised, and his jaw went hard. Doc, can we move her after you've tended to her? She's right about Dalton having this town in his pocket. Dr. Wilson nodded while he mixed up some medicine. Give me an hour to get some water in her and clean up these sores. Where are you thinking of taking her? My ranch is about 5 miles out of town. It ain't much to look at, but it's a good spot to hold, and I've got good men working for me. Harriet looked up at Jake, getting a real good look at him for the first time. His face was brown from the sun, with little lines by his blue eyes that made you think he smiled more than he scowled. A small scar cut across his left eyebrow, and his dark blonde hair could use a trim. He wasn't handsome like Edgar Dalton had been, but he seemed solid and steady, like a big old oak tree. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice just a whisper. You don't even know me. Jake's face softened up a bit. Let's just say I know a raw deal when I see one, Miss Caldwell, and I never could stand a bully. Dr. Wilson cleared his throat. Jake, maybe you should go get things ready for your guests while I take care of Miss Caldwell. And you might want to let your boys know you might have company. Jake nodded, catching the doctor's meaning. I'll send my foreman, Charlie Benton, to town with the wagon in about an hour. He's a red-headed fellow with a big mustache. You can trust him. As Jake turned to go, Harriet grabbed his sleeve. Mister, I don't even know your name. It's Zimmer, Jake Zimmer. He tipped the brim of his hat. You get some rest now, Miss Caldwell. Your nightmare is over. After Jake was gone, Dr. Wilson helped Harriet sip a tonic to get her strength back and started cleaning her wounds. That's a good man, he said quietly. Not many would go up against Edgar Dalton. Why is everyone so afraid of him? Harriet asked, flinching a little as the doctor put medicine on her raw skin. Money and connections, my dear. He owns about half the businesses in this town, including the bank that holds the paper on most every man's land. And what he don't own, he controls with his money or with threats. Your father was one of the few who ever stood up to him. Tears came to Harriet's eyes when she heard her father's name. He died so fast, I never even got to say goodbye. Dr. Wilson stopped what he was doing. Your father was a friend of mine, Miss Caldwell. His heart attack happened at a very good time for Edgar, right after your father told him he was going to expose some of his shady dealings. You think he... Harriet couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. I can't prove a thing, Grandma, the doctor said, choosing his words with care. But I do know that Jonathan Caldwell was healthy as a horse for a man of 55 when I checked him over just 2 weeks before he died. Harriet shut her eyes, feeling this new hurt pile on top of all the rest. When Father died, Edgar said he'd help me with the estate. He seemed so nice at first, but then when we found the will and saw that Father left his share of the orange groves to me instead of the partnership, he changed. And so he locked you up to get control of the groves, Dr. Wilson finished for her. With you gone and everyone thinking you went back east, he could just claim the property after a while. Yes, he kept telling me I just had to sign some papers and he'd let me go. But I knew that once I signed them, he'd have no reason to keep me around. Harriet shuddered thinking about it. Last night, he forgot to lock the attic door all the way. I waited till the sun came up, then I slipped out while the house was quiet. Dr. Wilson patted her hand. You're a very brave young woman. Now let me finish patching you up so you'll be ready when Mr. Benton gets here. Jake Zimmer's ranch might not be what you're used to, but you'll be safe out there. Jake rode his horse hard back to his little ranch, kicking up dust the whole way. His place wasn't much next to the big cattle ranches up north, or the rich orange groves that made men like Dalton wealthy, but it was all his, paid for with years of hard work. The main house was a strong 2-story building with a wide porch, built smart like a man who expects trouble now and then from his wilder days. The barn, the bunkhouse, and the corral were all kept up nice, and the small herd of cattle was the start of what he hoped would one day be a good business. He swung down from his horse in front of the bunkhouse, and Charlie Benton came out, whipping his hands on a rag. At 35, Charlie had been riding with Jake for nearly 10 years, all through Texas, Arizona, and now California. You're back mighty early, Charlie said. Something happened in town. Jake told him the whole story real quick while he put a saddle on a fresh horse for Charlie. Take the wagon and bring her out here. Doc Wilson is expecting you in about an hour. And Charlie, you be careful. Dalton ain't gonna take this lying down." Charlie let out a low whistle. "You sure about this, boss? We've been keeping quiet out here, building something good." "There's some things a man's just got to face, Charlie." Jake's face was set like stone as he answered. "Besides all that, Jonathan Caldwell sold me this piece of land for a fair price when not another soul in Riverside would give a Texan the time of day. I owe his daughter." After Charlie rode off, Jake kept himself busy getting the ranch's only spare room ready. It was a plain little room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out over the foothills. He put fresh sheets on the bed, swept the dust from the floorboards, and set out a pitcher of cool water and a clean towel. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. He was just placing the towel when he heard the sound of horses, way too soon for it to be Charlie coming back with Harriet. Jake walked over to the gun rack, picked out a Winchester rifle, and stepped out onto his porch. 3 riders were making their way toward the house. Edgar Dalton was right in the lead. Even from a ways off, Dalton looked like a big shot in his fancy tailored suit. His dark hair was combed back slick under an expensive hat. On either side of him were 2 rough-looking fellas Jake knew as hired guns, men who sometimes did the dirty work for Dalton's business dealings. Jake let the rifle rest easy in the crook of his arm. He was not aiming it, but he was making sure they saw it plain as day. "That's close enough, Dalton." The 3 men pulled their horses to a stop about 20 yards out from the porch. Dalton gave a smile that never quite made it to his eyes. "Mr. Zimmer, I hear you have taken an interest in something that is none of your business. When a woman comes running into a saloon saying she has been kept a prisoner, I reckon it becomes the business of any decent man," Jake said, his voice level. "Miss Caldwell is not well," Dalton said, smooth as silk. "Her father's passing hit her hard, and she has been having delusions. I have been looking after her, out of respect for my late partner, but she needs professional care. I have already made plans to send her to a sanitarium in San Francisco." Jake's expression did not flicker. It is funny how her delusions came with rope burns on her wrists that matched her story perfectly. Doc Wilson seemed to think they were mighty real. Dalton's pretend concerns started to show a few cracks. That meddling old fool needed to keep his nose out of other people's affairs. And so do you, Mr. Zimmer. I would surely hate to see something bad happen to this humble little place you have built here. Banking is such a tricky business. These days, loans can be called due at the worst possible times. "My land is paid for," Jake stated, his voice flat, "and I do not owe you or your bank a single dime, Dalton. Now I suggest you and your men ride on out to here before this conversation turns unfriendly." One of Dalton's men let his hand drift down toward his pistol, but Dalton just raised a hand to stop him. "This is not finished, Cowboy. That woman is my responsibility." "No," Jake corrected him. "She was your prisoner. Now she is under my protection, and unlike some of the folks in this town, I am not scared of your money or your hired guns." Dalton's face hardened into a cold mask. "You have no idea what you are getting into. The Caldwell girl has legal papers that have to be taken care of." "Then I reckon you can take those papers to a courthouse," Jake suggested, "in front of a judge that is not your cousin, with folks there to watch. How does that sound to you?" The threat in Dalton's eyes was clear as a blue norther, but he just turned his horse. "You have made a powerful enemy today, Zimmer." With that, he and his men rode away, kicking up a cloud of dust behind them. Jake watched them until they were clear out of sight. Then he went back inside to send one of his ranch hands to meet Charlie on the road. He sent a warning to be extra careful. He did not have a single doubt that Dalton would try something else. But for that moment, the trouble had passed. 2 hours later, the wagon rumbled into the ranch yard with Charlie holding the reins and 2 other ranch hands riding alongside as guards. Jake hurried out to give them a hand. Charlie pulled the wagon to a stop. Harriet was sitting next to Charlie, dressed now in a simple dress the doctor had given her. Her face was still pale, but she looked a sight stronger than when Jake had seen her last. Her brown hair was combed out neat and put in a simple braid, which made her delicate face and big green eyes stand out. Jake offered her his hand to help her down from the wagon. "Miss Caldwell, welcome to my home. It is not much to look at, but you will be safe here." Harriet took his hand, and she could feel the calluses that told of years of hard work. Mr. Zimmer, I do not know how I can ever thank you for what you are doing. No thanks are needed, he answered as he led her up to the house. Any decent man would have done the very same thing. That is not true, she said, her voice soft. There are plenty of decent people in Riverside who did nothing at all when I went missing. Jake could not argue with that point. Well, you are here now. Let me show you to your room. The inside of Jake's house was surprisingly comfortable. It was simple for sure, but it was clean, with sturdy furniture and a few things that made you think he had better taste than his cowboy clothes let on. There was a small bookshelf packed with books about history and literature, a nice painting of a Western landscape hung on one wall, and the curtains on the windows matched the fabric on the chairs. Were you expecting dirt floors and cow skulls on the walls? Jake asked with a small grin when he saw how surprised she looked. Her face turned red. I am sorry, I should not have assumed things. No harm done. Most folks see the dusty clothes and hear the Texas drawl, and they just fill in the rest with whatever they think a cowboy ought to be. He led her to the spare bedroom. It is not fancy, but the bed is comfortable and the door has a lock. I figured you might appreciate that after everything you have been through. That one small thought, the lock on the door, brought tears to Harriet's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Supper will be ready in about an hour, Jake said, acting like he did not see her getting emotional. You are welcome to rest until then, or there is a washroom down the hall if you want to clean up. I will leave you to it. After he shut the door behind him, Harriet sat down on the bed, feeling the weight of the whole day wash over her. For weeks she had been stuck in Dalton's attic. The only person she saw was the servant who brought her tiny meals, and every now and then, Edgar himself. He would switch between trying to sweet-talk her into signing away her inheritance and threatening her with what would happen if she did not. The lock on this door was different. It was on the inside. It gave her control. She turned the key just to feel it work, and then she unlocked it again. Being free was still a strange and fragile idea. She walked over to the small window and looked out at the ranch stretched out before her. The land was different from the citrus groves she grew up with. It was more rugged, with golden hills that rolled on toward far-off mountains. A few cowboys were finishing their evening chores, and the setting sun painted everything in a warm, golden light. Edgar would come for her. She knew that for certain. But for the first time since her father had died, Harriet felt something that was almost like being safe. Downstairs, Jake was talking with Charlie about how to keep the place secure. I want at least 2 men on watch around the clock, and nobody rides anywhere by themselves until this whole business is settled. Boss, just how do you figure this is going to end? Charlie asked. Dalton is not the kind of man to just give up, and we are already stretched thin as it is with the herd. Jake ran a hand through his hair. I sent a telegram to Judge Morrison down in Los Angeles. He is an honest man and does not have any connections to Dalton. If we can get Miss Caldwell's story in front of him, she has a good chance of legally getting her inheritance back. And what if Dalton decides he does not want to wait for the law to sort it out? Then we will handle it, Jake said, his voice grim. But I am hoping we can do this without any bloodshed, if that is possible. Charlie nodded. He understood the kind of man his boss was. Jake Zimmer was not afraid of a fight, but he had seen enough trouble in his life to know that a peaceful way was always better if you could find it. I had better go check on supper, Jake said, changing the subject. Mrs. Espinosa is probably wondering what all this commotion is about. The ranch's cook, a widow by the name of Alina Espinosa, had indeed been wondering about their surprise guest. When Jake walked into the kitchen, she was busy cooking enough food to feed a small army. So you bring home a senorita who needs saving, she said, giving him a knowing look. Just like something out of one of those dime novels you hide in your desk. Jake could feel his ears turning red. It is not like that, Mrs. Espinosa. She is Jonathan Caldwell's girl, the man who sold us this land. She is in a bad spot, that is all. Of course, she answered, but the look on her face said she did not believe a word of it. That must be why you changed your shirt and combed your hair before you came in to check on the stew. Jake had not even noticed he had done it. He was just trying to look a little more presentable for their company. The older woman turned back to her pots and pans, a small smile playing on her lips. The stew will be ready in a little while. Maybe you should go invite your company to eat with us. When Jake tapped on Harriet's door, she eased it open, and you could see the tension leave her shoulders the moment she saw it was him. Supper is just about ready, he told her. It is not anything fancy, but Mrs. Espinosa's cooking is the finest in 3 counties. Harriet offered a small smile, and Jake noticed how it lit up her whole face, chasing the shadows from eyes that had looked so haunted just a little while ago. It smells wonderful. I have not had a real meal in weeks. As they made their way downstairs, Jake felt a strange new awareness of her walking beside him. He had helped plenty of folks in a tight spot before, but he never felt this peculiar pull, this deep down need to make things right for her beyond just giving her a safe place to stay for a night. Dinner was laid out on the big table in the main room. Charlie joined them, while the other ranch hands ate over in the bunkhouse. Mrs. Espinosa had surely put her heart into it, serving up a thick beef stew with warm, fresh-baked bread and a side of early summer vegetables right from her own garden. Harriet ate with a slow, deliberate grace, as if she was tasting every single bite after going hungry for so long. The talk stayed light, with Charlie telling funny stories about life out on the ranch and Mrs. Espinosa making sure everyone's plate stayed full. It was only after the meal, when Mrs. Espinosa had gone to her own room and Charlie had left to check on the night watch, that Harriet finally brought up the one thing they had all been tiptoeing around. "Mr. Zimmer, Jake, please," he cut in softly. "Mr. Zimmer was my father. And truth be told, I never cared much for the man." She gave a little nod. "Jake, then, and you have to call me Harriet." She took a long, deep breath. "I have to know what is going to happen next. I cannot stay here forever, taking advantage of your kindness, but I do not have anywhere else to go. Edgar has my home, my inheritance, all of it." Jake leaned back in his chair, watching her face in the soft glow of the lamp. "I have already sent for a judge from Los Angeles. He is a man who has no ties to Dalton. With what you have to say and the proof from Dr. Wilson, we ought to be able to get you back what is rightfully yours and see that Dalton pays for what he has done. And until then you will stay right here where you are safe," Jake said, plain and simple. "I have got plenty of room, and Mrs. Espinosa seems mighty pleased to have another woman around the house. But what about the danger to you and your men? I saw Edgar right up here earlier. What did he tell you?" Jake thought about watering down the truth, but he reckoned Harriet deserved to hear it straight. The usual empty threats, talked about calling in loans, stirring up legal trouble. "Nothing that worries me none. But it will get worse," Harriet said, her voice dropping to just a whisper. "You do not know him the way I do. He will ruin anyone who gets in his way." Jake reached his hand across the table and laid it over hers. "Harriet, look at me." When she finally lifted her eyes to his, he went on, "Men like Dalton only have power because folks are scared of them. Well, I am not afraid of him, and you do not need to be either. Not a minute longer." "How can you be so sure? He has got money, connections, hired guns, and I have got right on my side, plus a few pretty good men with rifles," Jake answered with a little hint of a smile. "Besides all that, your father did me a good turn once, back when nobody else in Riverside would even give me the time of day. Helping you is not just about doing what is right. It is about paying back a debt." "You knew my father well?" Harriet asked, suddenly grasping for any link to the parent she had lost. Jake's face softened. "We were not close friends, but he was a decent man. When I first came to Riverside 5 years ago wanting to buy some land, most people took one look at my Texas accent and my past herding cattle and wrote me off. Your father, he judged me by my character. He sold me this very land for a fair price when other men were trying to cheat me or would not sell to me at all." "That sounds just like him," Harriet said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He always used to say that you measure a person by how they treat other folks, not by how they talk or where they are from." She paused for a moment, then asked, a little shy, "What did you mean about your past, if you do not mind me asking?" Jake was quiet for a second, deciding how much he ought to say. "After the war, I was not much more than a boy when it ended, but it left Texas in a real bad way. So I started driving cattle. I worked my way up from a cook's helper to a trail boss over 10 years. Somewhere along that trail, I got a name for being able to handle trouble without things getting bloody." "A gunfighter?" Harriet asked, her eyes getting a little wider. "No, ma'am," Jake corrected her, his voice firm. "I never hired out my gun, but I did help track down some men who had stolen cattle from my boss one time. That job led to other tracking jobs, helping folks who had been wronged when the law was not able or willing to step in. He gave a small shrug. Some folks around here heard tall tales and decided I was a dangerous man. Your father saw right past all that nonsense, and now you are a rancher. Trying my best to be, Jake said. It is a harder life than it looks, especially starting out small like we are. But it is honest work, and I can sleep at night. Harriet watched him for a long moment. I do believe my father was right about you, Jake Zimmer, and I am thankful for your help, no matter how all this turns out. Jake felt a surprising warmth spread through his chest at her words. We should both try to get some sleep, he said as he stood up. Tomorrow is liable to be a long day. That night, Harriet slept like a stone for the first time in weeks, feeling safe behind a locked door with armed men standing guard outside. Jake, on the other hand, stayed awake for a good while, going over his plans and wondering just why Harriet Caldwell's good opinion mattered so much to him after knowing her for less than a single day. Morning came with a rush of activity on the ranch. Jake had sent one of his men into town at the first sign of light to see how things were and to get a message to Dr. Wilson. By the time breakfast was on the table, the writer was back with some unsettling news. Dalton is offering a reward for any information on where Miss Caldwell is, the young cowboy said as they all sat around the kitchen table. He is telling everyone she is not in her right mind and is a danger to herself. He has got men watching every road leading out of town. Jake's brow furrowed. Did you get to see the doctor? Yes, sir. He said to tell you Judge Morrison got your telegram and will be here in 3 days. He also sent this for Miss Caldwell. The cowboy handed her a little package. Inside were several bottles of a tonic to build up her strength, along with a short note promising Harriet the doctor's full support. 3 days, Harriet said under her breath, a worried look on her face. Can we last that long? We have got enough food and water for a month, and enough men and guns to hold this place, Jake promised her. 3 days is nothing to worry about. After breakfast, Jake took Harriet for a walk around the ranch, partly to get her mind off her troubles, and partly because she seemed truly interested in how the whole operation worked. Even though she grew up around orange groves, she did not know a thing about raising cattle. My father wanted me to have a proper Eastern education, she told him as they walked over to the corral. I spent 4 years at a women's college up in Massachusetts, learning about books and music and art. It was all very refined and completely useless for real life. Jake smiled. I would not call education useless. Those books I have back at the house are not just for decoration. Reading has kept me from going crazy during some long, lonely winters. You surprise me more and more, Mr. Zimmer, Harriet said with a real laugh, the first one Jake had ever heard from her. Oh, I am so sorry. Jake, I keep forgetting. You keep laughing like that, and you can call me whatever you want, he said, and then felt his neck get hot, embarrassed by his own forwardness. Harriet blushed, but she did not look upset. Tell me about your cattle, she said, changing the subject as they got to the corral, where a few young calves were penned up with their mothers. For the next hour, Jake laid out the basics of ranching for her, everything from choosing the right breeds to rotating the grazing pastures and dealing with the markets down in Los Angeles. Harriet turned out to be a sharp student, asking smart questions that showed she was really listening and trying to understand. It is all so different from growing oranges, she said as they started walking back to the house for lunch. With the groves, everything is so neat and orderly. The trees stay put for decades. Both have their own troubles, Jake allowed. A drought will hurt us both, but we have got different pests and problems. I reckon that is why Riverside has got both businesses doing so well side by side. As they got closer to the house, Jake saw Charlie riding toward them, hell for leather, from the direction of the east pasture. His hand went to the pistol on his hip without him even thinking about it. Get behind me, he told Harriet in a low voice. Charlie pulled his sweat-soaked horse to a hard stop. Riders are coming, boss. 6 of them, and they are armed. Has to be Dalton's men. Jake cursed quietly. How far out? About 15 minutes. They are trying to be slick about it, coming up through the east ravine instead of using the main road. Jake turned to Harriet. Get inside and y'all stay put. Mrs. Espinoza knows where the shotguns are if things get hairy. He turned to Charlie and said, get our boys in position. Don't nobody fire unless they fire first, but I want them to see we mean business. Harriet grabbed hold of his arm. Jake, please don't let them kill you because of me. Maybe I ought to just go on with them. I could try to talk some sense into Edgar. No, Jake said, his voice like stone as he covered her hand with his own. Dalton had his chance to be sensible. He decided to lock you up instead. I'm not fixin' to let him drag you back. The fire in his blue eyes nearly took Harriet's breath away. Just be careful, she whispered, then hurried off toward the house. Jake and his hands took up defensive spots around the main house and the outbuildings. They had the upper hand, knowing every dip and rise of the land. Plus, the riders coming in would be wide open once they cleared the ravine and hit the flat ground of the ranch. When Dalton's crew finally showed, they found themselves staring down the barrels of Jake and 5 of his cowboys, all armed up and waiting. The whole bunch reined in their horses, clearly not expecting a welcome party like this. Jake recognized the fella out front, Tom Beck, one of Dalton's hired toughs who was with him the day before. "That's as far as you go, Beck," Jake called out. Beck just sneered back. "This here is private land. We've come for the Caldwell woman. Dalton says she's lost her senses, running around making up wild stories. He's just worried about her safety." "That's a strange way to show your concern, sending armed men to fetch her," Jake answered, his voice calm and cool. "She's staying right where she is." "Don't you be a fool, Zimmer," Beck growled. "You're outgunned, and Dalton's putting up $500 for her return. Just think what that kind of money could do for this sorry patch of dirt you call a ranch." A few of Jake's men bristled at that insult, but Jake didn't flinch. "Still looks like 6 of us and 6 of you to me, Beck. And my boys know this land a damn sight better than yours do." He let that hang in the air for a second, then said real slow, "And besides, even if you did somehow get past us, Miss Caldwell has already provided a sworn testimony about her lockup to Judge Morrison. Killing her now won't do Dalton any good. It'll just add murder to his list of wrongs." It was a complete bluff. The judge was still days out, but Beck had no way of knowing that. You could see the doubt flicker across the hired man's face. "We ain't leaving here without her," Beck blustered, but his voice didn't have the same bite. "Oh, yes, you are," Jake shot back. "Either you ride back the way you came, or you leave feet first. It's your decision." The quiet stretched out for a few long, tight seconds before Beck finally spit into the dirt. "This is not over, Zimmer, not by a long shot." He jerked his horse around and his men did the same, heading back toward the ravine. Jake made his men hold their ground until the riders were clean out of sight. "Charlie, take 2 men and follow them from a ways back. Make certain they're truly gone. Everybody else, keep your eyes peeled." That was just too easy. Inside the house, Harriet had been watching the whole thing from a window, her heart just about pounding out of her chest. When Jake finally walked in, she ran right to him. "Thank goodness you are okay. I was so scared when I saw how many of them there were." "Fellas like that tend to back down when you show them you won't be pushed," Jake said, even though he knew it was far from over. "But they will come back, won't they? And probably with more men next time." Harriet's face just fell. "So, it is only a matter of time." "No," Jake told her, his voice firm. "It's a matter of us holding on until the judge gets here. 3 days, Harriet? We can handle that." That afternoon, Jake sent another one of his hands to town. He told him to send a second wire to Judge Morrison, letting him know just how bad things were getting. The other men got busy fortifying the ranch, pushing the cattle out to the far pastures, stocking up on water in case someone tried to foul the well, and setting up their guard posts. As the sun started to set, Harriet insisted on giving Mrs. Espinosa a hand with making supper for the men. Jake found her there in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled clear up while she kneaded biscuit dough. "You don't have to be doing that," he said, standing in the doorway. Harriet glanced up, a little smudge of flour on her cheek. "I want to be useful. I can't handle a gun or stand watch, but I can at least make sure everyone has a hot meal." Jake just leaned against the doorframe, amazed at how right she looked there in his kitchen, especially for a woman with her fine education and fancy ways. "You are just full of surprises, Miss Caldwell." "And so are you, Mr. Zimmer," she answered with a little smile. "A cowboy who spends his time reading books and has a cook who taught herself English by studying Shakespeare." "Mrs. Espinosa told you that, did she?" Jake let out a chuckle. "She is something else." She also told me how you found her nearly starved to death in a border town after some bandits had killed her husband, and how you brought her here and gave her a place to be safe. Harriet's eyes got soft when she said, "It seems you have a habit of saving women who are in a tight spot." Jake shifted on his feet, not used to her looking at him that way. "Mrs. Espinosa talks too much, and it wasn't anything like that. She is a wonderful cook, and we needed one. It was just a simple business deal." "Of course," Harriet said, but the sound of her voice made it plain she did not believe him one bit. That evening, after a day that was tense but quiet, Jake was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, just watching the stars pop out. Harriet came out and joined him, pulling a shawl around her shoulders to ward off the cool night air. "May I sit with you?" she asked, motioning to the empty chair next to his. "Please do," Jake answered, getting up a little until she was settled. "There is still some hot coffee if you would like." "Some?" "No, thank you. I'm hoping I can get some sleep tonight, in spite of everything." They sat there in a comfortable quiet for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, the soft lowing of cattle here and there, the gentle nicker of the horses down in the barn, and the far-off cry of a nightbird. "It is peaceful out here," Harriet said in a soft voice. "So much different than town." Jake nodded. "That is why I picked this spot. After years on the trail and in crowded camps, I was ready for some space and quiet." "Do you not get lonely?" she asked, and then she looked a little embarrassed. "I am sorry, that is too personal of a question." "No, it is a fair question," Jake told her. "Sometimes I do, yes, but I have got my men and Mrs. Espinosa and my books, and I ride into town just often enough to remember exactly why I like it better out here." Harriet gave a small smile at that. "I think I understand. After my mother passed away when I was 16, my father just buried himself in his work. When I came back home from college 3 years ago, the house just felt so quiet, so empty. That is part of the reason I agreed to help him with the business, just to fill up all that silence." "You worked with your father in the citrus groves?" "I did. I mostly handled the account books, but I also learned all about the growing and the harvesting. Father always believed women were every bit as capable as men if they were just given the chance." Her voice turned a little hard. "Edgar pretended he felt the same way, but after Father passed, it was clear he thought the partnership papers were worthless because I was a woman. He kept on insisting that I needed a man to handle my business, meaning himself, of course." Jake's jaw went tight. Some men just cannot stomach the idea of a woman being their equal. Makes them feel small, I reckon. "Is that how you see women? As equals?" Harriet asked, looking at the side of his face in the faint light. "I have known too many strong, capable women to think any other way," Jake answered. "My own mother ran our farm for 3 years all by herself, while my father was off fighting in the war. Mrs. Espinosa survived things that would have broken most men I know." "And you?" He turned then to look her straight in the eye. "You escaped from a locked attic after weeks of being held captive, and then you found the courage to stand up and accuse one of the most powerful men in Riverside. I would say that makes you more than equal to most men I have ever met." Harriet felt a warmth spread all through her that had nothing to do with her shawl. No man had ever talked to her with that kind of real respect before. "Thank you for saying that," she said in a low voice. Their eyes held for a long moment, and something quiet and important passed between them. Jake found himself noticing little things he had been too busy to see before, like the gentle curve of her jaw. He saw the way her eyes held the starlight, and the single strand of hair that had slipped from her braid to rest against her neck. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jake was on his feet in a flash, his hand resting on his pistol, but he relaxed when he saw it was his own rider coming back from town. "Got news from town, boss," the young cowboy said as he swung down from his horse. "Dalton's offering $1,000 now for Miss Caldwell, and he is bringing in more men from San Bernardino. Folks are saying he is planning something big." Jake's face hardened. "Did our wire get to the judge?" "Yes, sir. The telegraph man confirmed he sent it. But there is more. Dr. Wilson has been arrested." "What?" Harriet gasped. "What are the charges?" "They are trying to say he was practicing medicine without a real license. It is a load of nonsense, and everybody knows it. Doc Wilson has been taking care of the folks in Riverside ever since this town was just a speck on the map, but Sheriff Mills went and locked him up this afternoon. Jake muttered a curse under his breath. Dalton is just getting rid of anyone who saw what happened. If the doctor cannot speak on your injuries, it makes our story against Dalton look weak. All the color drained from Harriet's face. This is all my fault. Dr. Wilson was only trying to help me, and now he is in trouble because of it. No, Jake said, his voice firm. This is what Dalton does, not you. And we are going to set it right. He turned his attention back to his rider. What is the word on those extra men coming? From the talk I heard down at the saloon, they are showing up tomorrow. Maybe a dozen of them. Jake gave a grim nod. Go get some rest. Tomorrow is fixing to be a long day. As the young man walked toward the bunkhouse, Jake turned back to Harriet. You ought to get some sleep too. I will have men keeping watch all through the night. How can I possibly sleep when I know what is coming? Harriet asked, her voice stretched tight with fear. Jake, maybe it is better if I just leave. I could try to get to Los Angeles by myself, find the judge, and get snatched up by Dalton's men. Before you even made it 10 miles, Jake said, finishing her thought. No, Harriet. The safest place for you is right here, with people who are going to protect you. But what will it cost you? She whispered, and tears started to well up in her eyes. Your men could be hurt, or worse, tomorrow. Dr. Wilson is sitting in a jail cell, and it is all on me. Jake took a step closer to her. He paused for just a moment before taking both of her hands in his. This is not on you. This is on Dalton, for his greed and his cruelty. And it is because some things in this world are worth fighting for. The honesty in his voice made Harriet look up and meet his eyes. Why are you really doing all of this? It cannot just be because my father sold you a piece of land one time. Jake was quiet for a spell, trying to find the right words. The first time I saw you in that saloon, holding that pistol with your hands shaking, but your eyes looking so determined, I saw something familiar in you. You refused to be broken by a cruel man. I have spent way too much of my life riding away from things that were important. I cannot ride away from this. I cannot ride away from you. The simple truth in his words stirred something deep inside Harriet. Without even thinking, she reached a hand up and laid her palm against his cheek. I am so glad you did not ride away. For a second, Jake thought he might just kiss her. He surely wanted to, but with everything going on, it was not the right time. Instead, he gave her hands a gentle squeeze before he let them go. Try to get some sleep. I will be right outside if you need anything. That night, neither of them got much rest. Jake spent most of the dark hours checking on his men standing watch and getting things ready for what the morning might bring. Harriet lay wide awake in the bed she had been given, thinking about the cowboy who had put everything on the line to help a woman he barely knew. She wondered about the new feeling growing inside her, a feeling that had nothing to do with being grateful. The dawn broke clear and hot. It promised to be another blistering summer day in California. Jake had his men set up in good spots around the ranch long before the sun came up. He figured Dalton's crew would show up early to try and catch them off guard. But the morning hours ticked by, quiet as a mouse, with no sign of the trouble they were expecting. By noon, the waiting had stretched everyone's nerves almost to the breaking point. Jake found Harriet in the kitchen. She was just going through the motions, slicing bread for the men's midday meal. Anything yet? She asked, glancing up as he walked in. Jake just shook his head. Not a peep. Could be they are waiting for sundown. Or maybe the information we got was wrong. Or it could be something else altogether, Harriet said, putting her knife down. Edgar is a crafty man. What if this whole threat about bringing in more men was just a story to keep us scared and looking the wrong way while he planned something different? Jake thought on that. Like what? I do not know for sure, but he is always thinking 3 moves ahead, like in a game of chess. My father always said that is what made him such a sharp businessman and such a dangerous man to cross. Before Jake could say anything back, they heard a ruckus outside, shouting and the sound of boots pounding the dirt. They both hurried to the door and saw one of Jake's men running full tilt from the direction of the cattle pasture. Fire, the man hollered. Somebody set the eastern pasture on fire. Jake let out a hard curse. The wind is blowing it straight this way. If that fire hits the dry creek bed, it is going to run right for the house and the barn. It was clear as day that this was the real plan. It was not a direct fight, but a wicked knife threat aimed at the ranch itself. In just a few minutes, Jake had his men organized. He sent some to try and stop the fire by digging a line in the dirt, while the others worked to move the horses and the closest cattle out of harm's way. "You stay in the house," Jake told Harriet as he got ready to go help his men. "If the fire gets too close, you take Mrs. Espinosa and get to the creek on the west side. The fire is not going to jump that much water." "I want to help," Harriet said with a firm voice. "I cannot just hide in here while everything you have worked for burns down." Jake did not have time to argue. "Fine. You help Mrs. Espinosa get buckets of water ready. If the wind changes and throws embers onto the buildings, you will need to put them out fast." For the next 2 hours, every single person on that ranch fought the spreading fire. The men worked like madmen with shovels and wet blankets, trying to make a barrier the flames could not get past. All the while, Harriet and Mrs. Espinosa got ready in case the main buildings caught a spark from the fire. From where she stood near the house, Harriet could see Jake out in the distance. His shirt was soaked clean through with sweat as he worked right beside his men. The smoke made it hard to catch a breath, and ash was falling like a dirty snow all over the ranch yard. Then she saw something that sent a chill straight to her bones. There were riders coming from the west, using the thick smoke to hide their approach. The riders were being led by Edgar Dalton himself. "Jake!" she screamed, but the wind just snatched her voice away. Without a second thought, she took off for the barn where the rifles were kept. She was not about to be taken without putting up a fight. Just as she got to the barn, a man stepped out from the shadows inside. It was Tom Beck, and he was grinning cruelly. "Well, well, Miss Caldwell, Mr. Dalton is going to be mighty pleased to see you." Harriet started backing away, but another one of Dalton's men showed up right behind her. She was caught. "No use running," Beck said, walking toward her. "You are coming with us, one way or another." "I would rather die," Harriet spat back, looking around in desperation for anything she could use as a weapon. Beck just laughed. "That can be arranged too, right after you sign what needs signing. Though it would be a real shame to waste such a pretty thing." The nasty way he said it made Harriet's skin crawl. As he reached out to grab her arm, she drove her knee up hard between his legs with every bit of strength she had. Beck folded over with a howl of pain, but the other man grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms to her sides. "You are going to pay for that, you witch," Beck gasped, as he straightened up with murder in his eyes. "I do not think so," a cold voice said from the barn entrance. Jake was standing there, his rifle aimed steady right at Beck's chest. "Let her go, now." The man holding Harriet just squeezed her tighter. "You are outnumbered, Zimmer. Dalton and the rest are right behind us." "Then I suggest you start saying your prayers," Jake answered, his voice flat. "Because if you do not let her go by the time I count to 3, you will be dead before they even get here." "1. He is bluffing," Beck snarled, but he did not take another step. 2. The man holding Harriet hesitated, and his grip loosened just a bit. 3. The crack of Jake's rifle sounded at the same time Harriet was shoved hard to the side. Her captor dove for cover as the bullet splintered the wood of the barn wall, exactly where the man's head had been just a second before. "The next one goes through flesh, not wood," Jake promised, working the lever on his rifle to load another round. "Now both of you get out of my barn." Beck was not a coward, but he knew that look in Jake's eyes. It was the look of a man who would not think twice about killing to protect what belonged to him. Slowly he started backing toward the door, and his partner did the same. As soon as they were out of the barn, Jake was at Harriet's side. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. She was still trembling from what had just happened. "No, but Edgar is here. I saw him with the others." "I know," Jake said, his voice grim. "The fire was just a trick to draw us out. The men have it under control now, but we are all spread thin." He pulled a pistol from his belt and handed it to her. "Take this. Get back to the house and stay with Mrs. Espinosa." "Jake," Harriet started to say, the fear clear in her voice. "I will be right behind you," he promised. "Go. Now." As Harriet ran for the house, Jake took up a position by the barn door, watching Dalton and his men ride closer. There were 8 of them, all armed, and they were spreading out to surround the ranch house. His own men were still busy with the last of the fire, not even aware of this new threat. Jake chose his target with care. Not Dalton himself, but the big water barrel sitting on the edge of the porch. His shot blew the barrel apart. sending a cascade of water down the steps. It created just enough of a distraction for him to sprint from the barn to the safety of the corral. From there, he was able to get the attention of Charlie and two other hands who were coming back from the fire line. Using quick hand signals, he told them to circle around behind Dalton's men while he laid down cover fire. The gunfight that followed was short, but it was fierce. Jake's men had the advantage because they knew every nook and cranny of the ranch. They used cover well, while Dalton's hired guns were stuck out in the open. In just a few minutes, two of Dalton's men were hit, and the others were pinned down behind whatever little cover they could find. "This is your last chance, Dalton," Jake yelled from his position. "Take your men and ride out, or you had better start digging graves." There was a long, tense moment of silence before Dalton's voice finally called back. "I want the Caldwell woman. You give her to me, and we will be on our way." "That is not going to happen," Jake answered. "Judge Morrison already has her sworn testimony about how you held her prisoner. It is all over." "I do not believe you," Dalton yelled back. "The judge is not supposed to be here for days yet." Jake cursed under his breath. Dalton had better information than he had figured. "Believe whatever you want to. She is not going anywhere with you." The standoff dragged on as the afternoon sun began to sink. Neither side was willing to risk an all-out fight. Jake knew that time was on his side. Sooner or later, his other men would be back from fighting that fire, and then Dalton would be seriously outnumbered. Inside the house, Harriet and Mrs. Espinosa had blocked the doors to the kitchen, which had the fewest windows and the thickest walls. The older woman had gotten herself a shotgun and looked surprisingly at ease holding the weapon. "I have not shot a man in 15 years, she remarked to Harriet, "but for Senor Jake, I would surely do it again." Harriet clutched her own pistol in a tight grip. "I have never shot anyone. I'm not even sure that I could." Mrs. Espinosa's face softened just a little. "When it is someone you love who is in danger, you learn you can do things you never dreamed you could." Harriet did not try to correct the woman's idea that she was in love with Jake. The truth was, she was not even sure what she was feeling anymore. She was grateful, of course, and she admired his courage and his character. But there was something else growing there too, something that had taken hold during these last few tense days they had spent together. A loud crash from the front of the house made both women jump. Someone had just busted through a window. Mrs. Espinosa planted herself by the kitchen door, her shotgun at the ready, while Harriet moved off to the side where she could peek out without being seen. Heavy boots were coming toward the kitchen. The door flew open, and Edgar Dalton himself was standing right there. His fancy suit was covered in dust and torn, and he had a wild look in his eyes. "There you are," he said, his voice sounding eerily calm as he stared right at Harriet. "Do you have any idea the amount of trouble you have caused me?" Mrs. Espinosa lifted the shotgun. "Take one more step, senor, and I will shoot you right where you stand." Dalton barely even looked at her. "Put that down, old woman, before you hurt yourself. This is between Miss Caldwell and me." "It is over, Edgar," Harriet said, her voice shaking but finding its strength. "Everyone knows what you did now." "Nothing is over until I say it is," Dalton shot back, taking a step toward her. "Your father's groves belong to our partnership, which means they belong to me. I offered you a fair deal. All you had to do was sign the papers." "A fair deal?" Harriet repeated, and she could not believe what she was hearing. "You locked me away in an attic, and you threatened to have me put in an asylum if I did not sign everything I own over to you." Dalton's face twisted up with fury. "You stupid girl. Do you have any idea how much those groves are worth now that the new railroad is coming through? Millions. Your father knew it. That is why he tried to cut me out of the deal at the very end. But I took care of him, just like I will take care of you if you do not start cooperating." "You killed my father," Harriet whispered. Hearing him admit what she had suspected all along hit her like a punch to the gut. "He had a weak heart," Dalton said, waving his hand as if it were nothing. "The digitalis in his evening tea just gave things a bit of a push. Nobody ever asked questions." He took out a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Now you are going to sign this, and we will put an end to all this foolishness." "I will not," Harriet declared, lifting the pistol Jake had given her. Dalton just chuckled. "You will not shoot me. You do not have the stomach for it." "Maybe she does not," a voice said from behind him. but I sure do." Dalton whipped around and saw Jake standing in the doorway. His rifle was aimed right at the businessman's heart. "Drop that paper and step away from her," Jake commanded. For a second, it looked like Dalton was going to listen. Then faster than you could blink, he lunged for Harriet. He grabbed her arm and yanked her in front of him like a shield. A little Derringer pistol appeared in his hand, and he pressed it to her temple. "Drop your guns or she is gone," Dalton yelled. "Both of you." Jake slowly lowered his rifle, but his eyes stayed locked on Harriet. "Easy now, Dalton. You do not want to do this. I am leaving with her," Dalton said, pushing the Derringer even harder against Harriet's head. "My horse is out back. If anyone tries to follow me, I will end her." "And then what happens?" Jake asked in a calm voice, trying to buy himself some time while he sized up the problem. "You will be a wanted man for murder." "Is that grove of trees really worth stretching your neck for?" "I will not get caught," Dalton said. He started inching toward the back door, holding Harriet tight against him. "Once she signs these papers, we can disappear. We can go to Mexico or South America." "You are out of your mind," Harriet spat, fighting against his hold. "I will never sign a thing for you." "You will," Dalton hissed right in her ear. "Or that cowboy you are so fond of dies first." Just as they got to the back door, Jake made a small motion toward Mrs. Espinosa, who had been standing quietly in the corner, nearly forgotten. The old woman knew right away what he meant and shifted her stance just a little bit. "Let her go, Dalton," Jake said one last time. "It is all over. Your men outside have already given up." "You are a liar," Dalton snarled, but you could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. In that brief moment when he hesitated, Mrs. Espinosa fired her shotgun. She did not aim at Dalton, but at the ceiling right above him. The loud blast broke the wooden beams, and pieces of wood rained down on them. Dalton was so startled his grip loosened just enough for Harriet to tear herself away and dive to the side. Jake threw himself forward, tackling Dalton before he had a chance to get his wits back. The Derringer fired with a loud crack, and the bullet dug itself into the floorboards. Then the two men were wrestling on the ground, a wild and ugly fight. Dalton fought with the pure desperation of a man who knew his life was over if he lost. For a man who wore fine clothes and had soft hands, Dalton was surprisingly strong. He managed to slam Jake's head hard against the doorframe, which stunned him for a moment. Dalton rolled away and scrambled for the little pistol that had fallen in the struggle. Harriet saw exactly what was happening. She did not even think about it. She raised the pistol Jake had given her and she fired. The bullet hit Dalton in the shoulder. It spun him clean around and sent him crashing into the wall. Jake shook his head clear and was on him in a second, pinning Dalton to the floor and yanking his good arm behind his back. "It is over, Dalton. You lost." Harriet stood there shaking, the pistol still in her hand as the weight of what she had just done washed over her. She had shot a man. He was the man who had killed her father and locked her away, but he was still a man. "Harriet," Jake called to her, in a soft voice, "it is all right. You can put the gun down now." Slowly, she lowered the weapon. Outside, they could hear men shouting as the rest of the ranch hands took care of Dalton's crew. "Mrs. Espinosa, find me some rope," Jake asked. He kept Dalton pinned down even though the man was still cursing and fighting. The older woman nodded her head and hurried off. She came back a moment later with a cord they used for tying up calves. Jake tied Dalton's hands tight behind his back. He paid no mind to the man's threats and his promises to get even. "You admitted to murder and kidnapping in front of witnesses," Jake told him in a cold voice. "The only place you are headed is to a prison cell, if you are lucky enough to dodge the hangman." Charlie showed up in the doorway, his face dirty from fighting the fire and the gunfight that followed. "We got the rest of them tied up, boss. 3 of them are wounded, but none of our boys are hurt bad. And you are not going to believe who just rode up. It is Judge Morrison himself with the United States Marshal and a small posse." A look of pure relief spread across Jake's face. "That is the best news I have heard all day. Get Dalton out there so he can face the law." As Charlie and another ranch hand dragged the struggling Dalton outside, Jake turned his attention back to Harriet. She was just standing there, her face as white as a sheet from the shock of it all. "Harriet," Jake said, walking toward her carefully. "Are you hurt?" She just shook her head, unable to speak. Then all of a sudden, her legs gave out from under her. Jake caught her before she could hit the floor, scooping her up into his arms. "It is just the shock setting in," Mrs. Espinosa said with a knowing tone. Take her on upstairs. I will bring up some tea with a little brandy in it. Jake carried Harriet to her room and laid her down gently on the bed. Her eyes fluttered open while he was putting a pillow under her head. I shot him, she whispered. I really shot Edgar. You saved my life, Jake said, correcting her as he sat on the edge of the bed. He would have killed me if you had not done something. I never imagined I could do a thing like that. Harriet's voice was quiet, but it was getting stronger. When I saw him going for that gun, I just did it without thinking. Jake took her hand and held it between both of his. That is what happens when someone you care about is in danger. Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, something special passed between them. It was a silent understanding of the feelings that had grown so fast while they were going through this terrible time together. Mrs. Espinosa came in with the tea she had promised. She was wise enough to leave right after she set it on the little table by the bed. Jake helped Harriet sit up. He put one arm around her for support while she took a sip of the strong, sweet drink. The judge is here, he told her. Dalton is going to answer for what he did to your father and for what he did to you. How did the judge get here so fast? I thought he was not due for several more days. I do not know, Jake admitted, but I am mighty glad he did. Things could have turned out a whole lot worse today. As the tea and brandy started to calm her nerves, some of the color came back to Harriet's cheeks. We should go downstairs. The judge is going to want my statement. Only if you feel up to it, Jake said gently. It can wait if you need to rest. Harriet shook her head. No, I want to face Edgar one more time. I want him to see that he did not break me. Jake helped her get to her feet, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow. As they were about to leave the room, Harriet suddenly turned to face him. Jake, she said, her voice barely a whisper, I don't know how to thank you for trusting me, for putting everything on the line to help me, she trailed off, trying to find the right words. For scooping you up and carrying you down, he finished for her with a soft smile, thinking about how he'd carried her from that saloon to the doc's office on that very first day. Yes, she breathed, for that and for every single thing after. Then she rose up on her toes and put her lips to his for just a second, a kiss that said thank you. But it was also something else, something filled with what was to come. Jake's arms circled her waist, pulling her in tight for a moment before he let go. We ought to head on down, he said, his voice a little thicker than usual, but we are not finished with this conversation. Downstairs, they found Judge Morrison, a man in his 60s who looked like he meant business, sitting at Jake's dining room table. With him was U.S. Marshal Davis, who was keeping a sharp eye on Edgar Dalton. The businessman was slumped in a corner, sulking, a bandage on his hurt shoulder and his hands still tied behind his back. Miss Caldwell, the judge said, getting to his feet as they came in. I am mighty relieved to see you are alive and well. When I got Mr. Zimmer's urgent telegram, I was already heading to San Bernardino. I decided to make a detour to Riverside right away, seeing as how serious this business sounded. Thank you for coming, Your Honor, Harriet answered. I am ready to tell you the whole story about what Edgar did to my father and to me. For the next hour, Harriet laid out the whole sorry tale, her father's suspicious death, Dalton's kindness that turned sour the second the will was read, the weeks he kept her locked away, and how she finally got free. The judge listened hard, only stopping her now and then to ask a question. And you believe Mr. Dalton used poison on your father? The judge finally asked. I know he did, Harriet said, her voice firm. He admitted it to me himself today, right here in this house. Mr. Zimmer and Mrs. Espinosa heard him say it. Judge Morrison looked over at Jake. Can you back that up, Mr. Zimmer? Yes, sir, Jake nodded. Dalton said he put digitalis in Jonathan Caldwell's tea at night, said it just helped along his weak heart. My father did not have a weak heart, Harriet put in. Dr. Wilson can tell you that, or he could if Edgar had not gotten him thrown in jail on made-up charges. The doctor's already been let go, Marshal Davis told them. We stopped in town before riding out here and got that whole mess sorted out. He will be examining your father's body as soon as we can arrange it. Though after all this time, finding any trace of poison might be tough. It does not matter, Jake pointed out. Dalton confessed, and we have more than one witness to him kidnapping and imprisoning her. Dalton, who had been quiet this whole time, finally spoke up. It is my word against theirs, and I am a respected man of business, while Zimmer here is nothing but a hired gun with a history of violence. And Miss Caldwell is clearly not in her right mind after the shock of her father's death. Judge Morrison gave Dalton a stare as cold as a winter morning. Mr. Dalton, I suggest you keep your mouth shut. The proof against you is mighty strong, and the stunt you pulled today, holding a gun to Miss Caldwell's head while trying to escape, sure is not helping you any. I want a lawyer, Dalton demanded, and a doctor for my shoulder. That woman shot me. After you tried to drag her off at gunpoint, the marshal reminded him dryly, you will get a doctor and a lawyer in Riverside. That is where you will be staying until your trial. Judge Morrison here will be in charge of it. I have already sent a boy to fetch Dr. Wilson to look at your wound, Jake said, his voice flat, which, to be honest, is better treatment than a man like you deserves. The judge cleared his throat. Miss Caldwell, we still have the issue of your father's estate. If Mr. Dalton has been twisting things the way you say, we are going to have to look over every legal paper related to the citrus groves and your partnership. My father's lawyer over in Los Angeles has copies of everything, Harriet said. Mr. Phillips at Phillips and Morgan. He can get you whatever you need. Very good. I will send for those papers right away. The judge stood up. Marshal Davis will take Mr. Dalton and his men to the jail in Riverside. I think it would be best if you stayed here, Miss Caldwell, until this is all settled, if Mr. Zimmer is agreeable to that. Miss Caldwell is welcome to stay as long as she needs, Jake confirmed, his eyes meeting Harriet's for a second. Not an hour later, Dr. Wilson showed up to patch up Dalton's shoulder, saying it was bad, but he would live. Then the marshal and his deputies rode off with their prisoners, which included Beck and the other thugs who had helped attack the ranch. Judge Morrison stayed a little while longer to have a private word with Jake and Harriet. This is going to be a big case. Mr. Dalton has some powerful friends, but the evidence we have against him is solid. Miss Caldwell, you need to get yourself ready for a tough trial. I will be ready, Harriet promised. He took my father from me and tried to steal everything I had. I will not let him get away with it. And she will not be facing it by herself, Jake added, his hand finding its way to hers. The judge saw their hands clasped together and raised an eyebrow, but he did not say anything about it. Very well. I will see you both in Riverside in 3 days for the first hearing. After the judge left, a tired quiet settled over the ranch. The men who had fought the fire and Dalton's crew were getting some rest. The damage was being looked over, and Mrs. Espinosa was in the kitchen fixing a big meal for everybody. Jake and Harriet ended up alone on the porch as the sun started to set, watching it dip down behind the hills to the west. The day's fight had left them both bone-tired, but there was a strange kind of energy there too. They had looked death in the eye together and come out on top. Your ranch was almost burned to the ground because of me, Harriet said, breaking the easy silence between them. How can I ever make that right? Jake just shook his head. The fire damage is not as bad as it could have been. We lost some pasture, but it will grow back. No buildings are gone, no cattle were lost, and none of my men got hurt bad. I would call that a win. Still, if you had not taken me in, I would have regretted it for the rest of my life, Jake cut in gently. Harry, helping you was the only right thing to do. I would do it again in a heartbeat. She turned to look him square in the face, studying his features in the warm light of the sunset. In the kitchen, earlier when you came for me, you could have been killed. So could you, he pointed out, but you stood your ground. You even saved my life. That is not something I am ever going to forget. Harriet managed a small smile. Mrs. Espinosa said something to me while we were all in that standoff. She said, and when someone you love is in danger, you find out you can do things you never dreamed you could. Jake's breath hitched at her words. She is a wise woman, Mrs. Espinosa. Yes, Harriet agreed, her voice soft. I think she is. She took a deep breath before she went on. Jake, I know we have only known each other for a handful of days, and maybe what I am feeling is just me being grateful for your help, or maybe it is just how intense everything has been. But it feels like more than that. Jake finished for her when she stopped. Like something that was just meant to happen. Relief washed over Harriet's face. Yes, exactly like that. Jake took her hands in his rough fingers gentle on her smooth skin. Harriet, I do not know what comes next. You are going to have your inheritance back soon, your groves, your place in town. And I am just a cowboy out here trying to build something. But I know one thing for sure. I do not want to say goodbye to you when all this is over. Good, Harriet replied with a surprising strength, because I am not going anywhere. When he looked surprised, she kept going. Jake, I have spent my entire life doing what everyone expected of me. The right schools, the right manners, always worried about how things looked. Even coming back to help with my father's business was partly about doing what he expected. And now, Jake asked, his blue eyes locked on her face. Now, for once in my life, I want to follow my heart. And my heart is telling me that whatever is growing between us is worth exploring. And to heck with what society expects. A slight blush rose on her cheeks at her own boldness, but she did not look away. A slow smile spread across Jake's face. Well, Miss Caldwell, I do believe this California air agrees with you. It is not California, she corrected, stepping so close he could feel her breath. It is you. This time when they kissed, there was nothing quick or shy about it. Jake's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him as if that was where she had always belonged. Harriet's hands went up to his shoulders, then around to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. When they finally broke apart, they were both a little out of breath. Jake rested his forehead against hers. I probably ought to mention, he said with a grin, that Mrs. Espinosa is watching us through the kitchen window and looking mighty pleased with herself. Harriet laughed, and the sound was freer and happier than Jake had ever heard it. Let her look. I am not ashamed of how I feel about you. The days that followed were a whirlwind of getting ready for the hearing. Harriet gave long statements to the marshal, met with the lawyer who had taken care of her father's properties, and slowly started to take back her own life and everything that was hers. Judge Morrison was a man of his word, and he pushed things along quickly, even with Dalton's important friends trying to slow things down. A look at Jonathan Caldwell's body, after it was dug up, did in fact show traces of digitalis poison, proving Dalton's confession was true. Through every bit of it, Jake stayed right by Harriet's side, a solid rock that gave her strength when the bad memories tried to creep back in. And in return, Harriet helped Jake figure out the damage to his ranch and make plans to fix it. The two of them just clicked, like they were made to fill in each other's gaps. On the evening before the court date, they sat on the porch swing Jake had put up just for her, soaking in the cool air as the sun went down. I've been doing some thinking, Jake said, his arms settled easy and warm around her shoulders. After all this legal trouble is over and done with, you're going to have to figure out what comes next for your father's groves. Harriet gave a slow nod. I have been weighing my choices. I suppose I could sell them, but that feels like I would be turning my back on my daddy's whole life's work. Or I could bring in a manager to see to them she paused, looking up at Jake, while I look into some other interests. What kind of interests might those be, he asked. But the light in his eyes told her he already knew. Well, she said with a playful smile, I've taken a real shine to the idea of cattle ranching lately. That whole way of life seems to call to me. The wide open country, the good honest work, and the people. Jake's smile got wider. That is a hard road, Miss Caldwell. Not a lot of creature comforts, and not much in the way of high society. I have had my fill of society to last me the rest of my days, Harriet said with purpose. And as for comforts, she moved in closer, her words a soft whisper against his ear. I reckon we could figure out how to make ranch life plenty comfortable. Jake let out a laugh and pulled her in tighter. Well, Harriet, you just keep on surprising me. But what about the groves? That's valuable land, a real solid business. I had a thought about that, she confessed. What if we were to join them together? The citrus groves make money all year long, while the cattle operation has its ups and downs. If we combine them, they could be stronger together than either one is by itself. Jake looked at her then with a whole new kind of respect. You have been thinking just like a businesswoman. I am my father's daughter, she said, reminding him gently. He raised me to find an opportunity where other folks might not even be looking. It is a fine plan, Jake admitted. But the way you are talking, it is as if our futures are already braided together. Harriet held his gaze, her own steady and clear. Are they not? Unless I have been completely wrong about what has been growing here between us. Jake took her hand, his face turning serious. Harriet, I need to make one thing perfectly clear. I care about you more than I ever thought I could in such a short while, but I do not want you to feel grateful. I do not want you feeling like you owe me something because I was there to help when you needed it. Jake Zimmer, Harriet said, her free hand gently cupping his cheek. Do you truly believe I am the sort of woman who would build a life with a man out of some sense of obligation? After every single thing I have survived, do you imagine for 1 second I would ever settle for anything less than love? Love? Jake echoed the word, his voice soft. Is that truly what you feel for me? Yes, she answered, plain and simple. I love your strength, and I love your gentle heart. I love that you treat every person with decency, no matter their place in the world. I love that you will risk it all for what is right. And yes, I love that you climbed into a dusty attic to carry me down when I needed saving. But I also love that you see me as someone who is strong enough to stand right beside you, not trail along behind you. Jake's eyes, which had never seemed so blue, filled with deep emotion at her words. I love you too, Harriet. And there is nothing in this world I want more than to build a life with you, joining our lands and our lives into one. He paused for a moment, then reached inside his pocket. I have been carrying this with me for 2 days, just waiting for the right time. He pulled out a small ring, a simple band of gold with a single perfect pearl. It was my grandmother's. It is not fancy like the jewelry I am sure those society women in Riverside wear, but it has been in our family for 3 whole generations. It is beautiful, Harriet whispered, tears starting to well up in her eyes. Harriet Caldwell, will you marry me? Not tomorrow, mind you. We ought to give ourselves time to be certain, to let all the talk from this trial fade away. But will you promise me you will be my wife when the time is right? Yes, she said, with no hesitation at all, holding her hand out so he could put the ring on her finger. Yes, I will marry you, Jake Zimmer, whenever and wherever you say. The ring slipped on as if it was made for her. Jake raised her hand to his lips, kissing the ring first, and then the center of her palm, which sent a little shiver of happiness right through her. I should probably warn you, he murmured against her skin, that Mrs. Espinosa is likely already planning out our wedding. She has had that calculating look in her eye ever since she saw us kissing. Harriet laughed. Well, then we had better not let her down, but Jake, I was serious about not rushing things. I want us to do this the right way, not because we feel like we have to, but because we choose to, when we are both truly ready. Jake nodded, his eyes full of understanding. We have all the time in the world now, Harriet. Dalton cannot lay a hand on you ever again. The preliminary hearing the very next day played out just like everyone knew it would. With the proof of Jonathan Caldwell's poisoning, Harriet's own testimony, and Dalton's foolish and threatening words that several people had heard, Judge Morrison had no trouble at all in ordering the businessman to stand trial for murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder. As they led Dalton away in chains, he threw one last hateful look at Harriet and Jake. This is not over, he hissed. I still have friends. But you are going to a hangman's rope, Jake answered, his voice calm, and that is all that matters. Outside the courtroom, Dr. Wilson walked up to them, looking tired but pleased. Justice for Jonathan, at long last, he said, taking Harriet's hand in his. He would be so proud of you, my dear. Thank you, Doctor, Harriet said. I never could have done this without your help, and Jake's. The doctor's eyes moved between the two of them, taking in how close they stood and the pearl ring now on Harriet's finger. Well, I see some congratulations are in order. Jonathan would have approved, you know. He always spoke very highly of Mr. Zimmer's character. He did? Harriet asked, looking surprised. Dr. Wilson nodded. He said Zimmer was one of the few men around these parts who cared more for his integrity than for his profits. A rare thing in the business world, he called it. Jake looked a little embarrassed, but also pleased to hear this praise from beyond the grave. Mr. Caldwell was a fair man. I respected him a great deal. And he respected you, the doctor confirmed. Now, if you will excuse me, I have patients to see. Miss Caldwell, your father's house is in perfect order. The staff has all been kept on and paid from the estate. You can go home anytime you like." After he was gone, Harriet turned to Jake. "I had not even allowed myself to think about the house. It was my home my whole life, except for those years I was away at college." "We ought to go there," Jake suggested. "You need to see the place to know what you want to do." The Caldwell house was situated on the north side of Riverside. It was a handsome two-story home surrounded by neat and tidy gardens. It was not as big or flashy as Dalton's mansion, but you could see Jonathan Caldwell's success and his good taste in every detail. As Jake and Harriet walked toward it, the front door swung open and an older woman in a housekeeper's dress appeared. "Miss Harriet," she cried out, hurrying it toward them. "Oh, thank the good Lord you are safe. We have all been worried sick, Mrs. Henderson." Harriet greeted her with a warm hug. "I am all right, truly. This is Jake Zimmer. He is the one who helped me get away from Edgar." Mrs. Henderson gave Jake a small curtsy. "Bless your heart, sir. We knew deep down something was wrong when Mr. Dalton announced that Miss Harriet had suddenly gone back east. It was not like her to leave without a proper goodbye, especially not to the staff who had known her since she was just a little girl." "Why did none of you say anything?" Harriet asked as they walked inside with the housekeeper. "Oh, we tried, miss. Mr. Peters, the butler, he went to see Sheriff Mills, but the sheriff just brushed him off, saying he was just a servant getting worked up over nothing. After that, Mr. Dalton made it very plain that anybody who questioned Miss Harriet's trip would be out of a job." The older woman wrung her hands. "I am so terribly sorry we failed you." "You did not fail me," Harriet told her firmly. "Edgar could be very convincing, and he would be very dangerous. I am just so glad that all of you are safe." The inside of the house was precisely how Harriet remembered it. It was comfortable and elegant without being showy, and it was filled with memories of her father and the life they shared. She wandered slowly from room to room, her hand brushing against familiar furniture, getting to know the place that had always been her home all over again. Jake stayed back a few steps, giving her space, knowing this was a heavy moment for her. He could not help but notice the quality of everything, from the furniture and the paintings to the silver and crystal shining in the dining room. It was the home of a wealthy man, a place far grander than his own modest ranch house. "This was my father's study," Harriet said, opening a door that led to a fine room lined with books and centered around a big, sturdy desk. "He spent hours in here looking over the business ledgers, meeting with his partners and his workers." Jake took in the room with a look of interest. "It is a fine room. You can still feel his presence in here." Harriet nodded, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood of the desk. "Yes, I almost expect him to walk right through that door and ask me why I am messing with his papers." Her voice cracked a little on the last few words. Jake came to her side and put a steadying hand on her back. "He would be proud of you, Harriet. You stood up for his legacy, and you won." "Not by myself," she reminded him, leaning into his comforting touch. "I never could have done it without you." They used the rest of the afternoon to walk through the house. Harriet showed Jake the room she grew up in, the gardens her mother had planted, and the little office next to her father's where she used to help with the account books. "It is a beautiful home," Jake said when they were getting ready to go. "You belong in a place like this, with your father's things around you, close to the groves he worked so hard to build." Harriet looked closely at his face. "Are you trying to tell me I should stay here instead of coming out to the ranch?" "No," Jake said in a hurry. "I am just saying that this place is a part of who you are. I would not want you to give it up completely." Harriet thought about this as they rode back toward Jake's ranch. "Maybe we could use both places," she offered. "We could live at the ranch most of the time, but keep the house for when business in town makes us stay over, or for entertaining business partners." "That could work out," Jake agreed. He was relieved to hear her still talking about a future with him. "Though I have to admit, I am not much for entertaining. You might like it more than you think," Harriet teased him. "My father's wine cellar is one of the best, and Mrs. Henderson is an even better cook than Mrs. Espinosa. But please do not tell her I said that." Jake laughed out loud. "Your secret is safe with me. But speaking of Mrs. Espinosa, we ought to get back. She will have supper on the table, and she starts to worry when we are late." The weeks that followed were busy for the both of them. Jake put all his energy into fixing the fire damage at his ranch, and at the same time he started learning all about the citrus business. Harriet split her days between getting her father's business matters back in order and helping out at the ranch. It turned out she had a real knack for working with the horses. They fell into a comfortable routine together. Their different backgrounds and talents seemed to fit together in ways they had not expected. Jake's practical knowledge of the land was a perfect match for Harriet's good head for numbers and business plans. Her connections with folks in Riverside opened doors that had always been shut to the Texas rancher. In turn, his straightforward way of doing things cut right through the nonsense that you sometimes found in town society. As summer started turning into fall, the trial of Edgar Dalton began. It was a hard time for Harriet. She had to live through her captivity all over again on the witness stand and look at her father's killer day after day in that courtroom. But Jake was right there by her side the whole time. His quiet strength was what held her up through the toughest moments. The verdict, when it finally came, did not surprise anyone. Guilty on every single charge. Judge Morrison sentenced Dalton to hang for the murder of Jonathan Caldwell. He also gave him more prison sentences to be served one after the other for kidnapping Harriet and for the attempted murders out at the ranch. "It is finally over," Harriet said as they walked out of the courthouse after the sentencing. "He can never hurt anyone ever again." Jake gave her hand a squeeze. "You did it, Harriet. You got justice for your father." "We did it," she corrected him, looking up at him with all the love in the world in her eyes. "And now we can finally start thinking about our future." That future started to become a real thing in the weeks that came after. Once Dalton was convicted, Harriet got full control of her father's shares in the partnership. The first thing she did was buy out the other partners, which made her the one and only owner of the Caldwell citrus groves. At the same time, Jake grew his cattle business, buying up more grazing land right next to his property. Together, they started to build Harriet's dream of joining the two businesses. They used the steady money from the citrus groves to help the ranch grow. The ranch gave them another source of income that did not depend on the seasons like the groves did. And while their businesses grew side by side, so did their love for each other. What started in a time of real trouble sure did grow into something wonderful. Jake found himself drawn to Harriet's sharp mind and her sheer grit, while she saw the good, steady strength in him. By Christmas of 1875, just 6 months after they first met in the Last Chance Saloon, they were ready to make it official. The wedding was held at Harriet's family home, which was all dressed up for the holiday and the big day. Judge Morrison said the words, and with her own father gone, Dr. Wilson was the one who gave the bride away. Mrs. Espinosa cried clear through the entire service, bless her heart. Charlie and the other ranch hands stood there looking a mite uncomfortable in their Sunday suits, clutching their hats in their hands. The society ladies from Riverside, the very same ones who used to whisper about poor Miss Caldwell, now just watched with envy as she shone with happiness beside her handsome man. "I, Harriet, take you, Jake, to be my husband," she said, her voice carrying clear through that crowded room. "To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part." Jake's voice was just as firm when he repeated his vows, and his blue eyes never once left Harriet's face. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared left no one in that room with any doubt about how deep their feelings ran. The celebration that followed was a true mix of their two lives. You had ranch hands and citrus workers, town merchants and society women, all of them gathered together to wish the couple well. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Espinosa took charge of the kitchen, each one trying to cook up a dish better than the other for the wedding feast. Late in the evening, as the party kept going downstairs, Jake and Harriet slipped away upstairs to the master bedroom. It had been Jonathan Caldwell's, but it was now theirs whenever they stayed in town. "Are you happy, Mrs. Zimmer?" Jake asked in a low voice as he closed the door. "Impossibly so," Harriet answered, stepping into his arms. "I never imagined I could find such joy after all that happened. That is the funny thing about life," Jake considered, his hands gently undoing the tiny buttons down the back of her wedding gown. "Sometimes the worst moments lead you straight to the best ones. If Dalton had not locked you in that attic, you never would have carried me down," Harriet finished for him, her own fingers working at his tie, "and we might never have found each other." "I like to think we would have," Jake said, pressing a kiss to her newly bare shoulder. "Some things are just meant to be, no matter what path gets you there." Harriet smiled up at him, her heart feeling full to the brim. "I believe you are right, Jake Zimmer. Some things are simply meant to be. Their wedding night was everything they had both dreamed of, full of tenderness and passion. A perfect beginning to the life they planned to build together. As they lay in each other's arms later, watching the moonlight filter in, Jake traced slow patterns on Harriet's bare shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him drowsily. "The future," he replied. "Our ranch, our groves, maybe someday our children running around both places." Harriet nestled closer to him. "I would like that. A boy with your blue eyes, maybe a girl with your stubborn determination." "My determination," Jake laughed softly. "I think that particular trait would come from you, Mrs. Zimmer." "Perhaps we are both a bit stubborn," she agreed with a smile. "But that is what got us here, is it not? Refusing to give up even when things seemed impossible." "That is true enough," Jake agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And I would not change a thing." Over the years that followed, the Zimmers' businesses did very well. The Caldwell Zimmer Ranch became known all around for its fine cattle, while the citrus groves expanded to new markets because Jake had friends among the merchants in Los Angeles and San Francisco. They divided their time between the ranch and the townhouse, finding a balance that let them manage both properties the right way. Their first child, a son they named Jonathan after Harriet's father, was born in the fall of 1876, followed 2 years later by a daughter. They called Elizabeth after Jake's mother. The children grew up with the best of both worlds. They were riding horses and learning ranch work alongside their father, and they were also getting the education and learning the culture that their mother valued from her own upbringing. Jonathan showed a real knack for the cattle business early on, while Elizabeth had her grandfather's head for numbers and business plans. Through it all, Jake and Harriet's partnership was the foundation of their success. They faced every challenge together, whether it was droughts that threatened the cattle and the citrus, hard economic times, or the occasional argument with neighbors. They were always a united front. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Jake surprised Harriet with a special gift. It was a small painting of the attic window from which she had escaped, done in soft colors that somehow turned a scene of her imprisonment into something hopeful. "To remind us both where our story began," Jake explained as Harriet looked at the painting with misty eyes, "and how far we have come since then." "It is perfect," she whispered, touching the canvas gently. "The darkest moment that led to the brightest life." Jake gathered her into his arms. "When I climbed up to that doctor's office and carried you down, I had no idea I was carrying my whole future in my arms. And when I fired that shot into the ceiling of the Last Chance Saloon, I never dreamed I was calling out to the man who would become my husband," Harriet added with a mild smile. "Life has a way of surprising you," Jake observed, kissing her tenderly, sometimes in the best possible ways. As they stood together, with 5 years of shared life and love between them, and many more stretching out ahead, both silently knew the truth of those words. From the darkest confinement had come the greatest freedom. From fear had grown courage. From a desperate escape had emerged a journey home. She had been locked in an attic for weeks. He had climbed up and carried her down. And in that act of rescue, they had both found something neither had been looking for, but both had always needed. It was a love strong enough to overcome any obstacle, to build a life worth fighting for, and to transform two separate paths into one shared journey that would last a lifetime.